Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. In today's episode, we're going to be continuing on my 135i project. Now, if you haven't seen the previous episode, I accidentally acquired this vehicle when I was left unsupervised. What ended up happening to this engine was that two little stainless steel or steel bits, screwdriver bits, ended up being accidentally dropped into the intake track, and of course the turbos decided to munch down and carnage ensued. So this engine I couldn't completely trust after I ended up buying it because there was metal throughout. So I ended up purchasing the replacement engine here. In the last episode, we continued with throwing stuff at this motor to get it up and ready. Of course, we did a full inspection. We resealed it. We did the oil pan, gasket, valve cover gasket, new valve cover at this point, and budget kind of went out the window. We might be kind of close, but we're gonna have to see. So I'm gonna show you really quick what we ended up adding just off screen and give you a rundown. For this one here, we ended up resealing the oil filter housing. Now both gaskets were done, so the one that actually meets the block and the cooler one just inside here. Of course, I needed a bit of a reminder just in case. This was all nice, cleaned down. I ended up spraying it down with gasoline and used a brush, so it turned out pretty nice and clean. In behind the harmonic balancer, we ended up putting the crank seal guard. Now this one here, when I had the balancer off, there was clear indication that it had ate a belt at some point. So fortunately, it's all good and clear. We checked in the block, in the pan, nothing's there. This was new, so that's just something that kind of coincides. You end up opening this up to get everything off the chain when it eats a belt. Mickey Mouse flange, of course, this is just the rain version. Not sure why it's white, not aluminum, but we'll go with it. The piece de resistance is the front-facing sheet metal manifold. Now this is a BMP version, and of course I learned a little bit the hard way, we'll say, is that this flange wasn't welded at the right angle. So I'm gonna have to figure out what I'm gonna do for that. But moving here, we're gonna have some DW 750 injectors with the point rail, of course the Precision Raceworks coil conversion, and the blue spaghetti noodles that are going up and over. This here, we ended up taking the bracket and ended up flipping it, I believe, 180. So it was originally like this, and we have it a little bit further back. Reason being is the coils are gonna sit a little bit further. It's gonna be up and over the runners, so you're not gonna have to stare and see all the disaster in between them. But at the same token, if you disconnect all of these, and you disconnect the two screws here, you'll be able to actually pull the rail up and out if you need to pull out these injectors without having to fully disassemble your coil packs. So this we're gonna just leave as is for now. And moving over to the turbo. This is the 013-6466 turbo with the T4 flange upgrade. Other than that, we just tried to mock it up as best we could with the coolant pipe. Of course, I find out after that this is off a manual, so we're gonna have to swap this for the one that's actually in the vehicle. And like I mentioned in the previous video, water pump and thermostat, because this vehicle, that's the only thing that it had for maintenance, and this is questionable. So we're gonna start on the vehicle here. Of course, I got my helpers here. There's Joseph and Taylor. Thoughts, Taylor?
Let's go.
I think he's more excited than I think the both of them are more excited than I am.
Let's go.
Whoosh.
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 Like any other project, we start by staring at the vehicle and starting to turn bolts and removing pieces. The poor front lip that was on this vehicle has seen better days. I'm not completely certain if we're going to be refinishing it or replacing it. I guess time will tell. Of course, this vehicle on its own is the gift that keeps on giving, whether it's bits or aggravation.
Tony, you found a bit.
Another one? No way, come on.
From the car?
Had to have.
Here we have the 135 Archaeology. So this one here was found in the outlet. This little one right here was found in the intercooler, and this one was on the skid plate. Of course, Taylor just found this one here, or maybe it was the other one. Maybe if we look hard enough, we'll have a set, and then I'll just give them back. Taylor jumps inside and starts to remove the factory shifter. Now, because we're going with an 8 HP 45, it's going to be what's called an E shift. So the 135 has an M shift, so a manual shift or a mechanical shift, with linkages going down to the transmission. The E shift is simply just harnesses. After Taylor starts taking that apart, we pull the front end off, which ends up coming out quite easy, or a lot easier than I had expected. And once the front end is off, you can start by taking everything else off. Note to self, when you go to remove the AC lines, just make sure that all of the compressed air, make sure all the compressed air is out of the lines before you disconnect them.
Whoa. What the is that?
My eyes are spicy.
What just popped?
Look at me for a second.
What was that? Was that cool?
That was the refrigerant.
Oh, I thought you drained it.
I did. It must have built up a bit of pressure and it went right in my face. Yeah, Taylor, whatever, shut up. I don't want to hear it. Of course, after we end up taking off the front end, including the radiator, the AC condenser, intercooler, and all that jazz, Taylor can slide underneath to remove the torque converter bolts. So as I spin the motor over by hand, it gives Taylor access to each bolt head. Of course, right through the inspection window or whatever it's called, it's easier to do this in the car than out. After Taylor is done pretending that he's actually doing something, now it's time to actually pull this lump out of the vehicle. We lift it up and over the subframe and throughout. It's a lot easier once you end up having the drive shaft and everything disconnected so that you can pull the transmission in one. And of course, we're left with a gaping hole that's called the engine bay. Well, ladies and gentlemen, as you may or may not have seen, we fought with it a little bit, but being that this one's rear wheel drive, I guess it could have been a lot worse. There's the sad lump sitting there in its glory. As you can see, we have quite the mess ahead of us to clean up. For the most part, it went relatively okay. The nicest part, I guess you could say, would be we didn't need to remove the steering rack. We didn't need to drop the subframe. We didn't need to do the majority of that. I think the only thing we had to do was just move this one power steering line. Of course, the rear inlet, this one needed to avenge its brothers. It didn't want to break for us to get out. Now, the biggest reason why we ended up needing to take the inlet off is when you go to pull the motor, you have this tiny little hole here. So what we do is we chuck a bolt through there and then the chain and up and around. So the biggest thing is you don't want the chain to be on the plastic manifold, otherwise it can crack it. But with that stupid bloody inlet up and around here, it was fighting us, and yeah, that one didn't want to break like every other one that I've dealt with. So whatever, inlet 1, Tony 7, so my odds are still pretty all right. Now we, again, just threw it in a tire because I need to just double check everything on this side here to finish that. Some things we probably didn't show you is the alternator, it's bad. So the clutched pulley is bad on both of them. One has play and one is actually locked up a bit. Other than that, to get around the steering shaft, we just needed to loosen this engine mount so it doesn't smack the steering shaft. Last thing you want to do is have it bent or dented or whatever. It's all aluminum. All in all, it's not too bad. Of course, for cleanliness sake, as you can see, these gloves started white, and why did I just do that? So I'm going to dig out the pressure washer. Hopefully it's thawed up by now, or at least the lines. And hopefully I can actually turn on the pressure washer, or at least the hose on the side of the house. I'm going to pre-pressure wash it, so spray it all off with whatever will come. Spray it down with a degreaser, scrub it, get it nice and squeaky clean. It wouldn't make a lot of sense to put a nice clean engine into a dirty ass engine bay. Yeah, good times. And we're back. It's been 52 years and I haven't aged a day. For the engine itself, what we ended up doing off screen for the most part, I actually show you here, is we ended up wrapping the majority of the harness just with fabric tape. Of course, because we ended up having a spare motor, I ended up just labeling them all. Relatively foolproof for up here. We did what we could to just retain all of the factory pieces, but of course we're gonna clean this all up once the time comes. We did take the alternator, starter, and whatnot off. The alternator was bad, so I had to get that rebuilt. So there's been quite a few things that have been happening in the background. Other than the obvious in here, one other thing is we did end up drilling the fuel rail. So if you end up looking at a photo, now you can look at any N54 fuel rail. The inlet right in here is a pinhole size. So I drilled it out to 1/16 with a drill bit, and I did the exact same for each one of these. Now between the N53, which is the European model, non-turbo direct injection, it has a 3mm size hole, which I can't understand why you would have it, but people have gained a couple or a few hundred PSI of rail pressure simply by drilling it. Now along with that, there's a little filter just inside the high pressure fuel pump that you can pick out for obvious reasons. Put an inline 10 micron filter and you're off to the races. A couple other things that I guess I should mention is this here is the high side flapper. So if you end up breaking off that fork piece, what you can do, because this is the same size as the port on the valve cover, all I end up doing is find whatever size hose this is and put a worm clamp on it, and you're pretty much good to go. It has the RB PCV valve that integrates the Toyota Supra PCV valve right from Toyota. So that'll go to a catch can once we get it in the car and situated. That's relatively it for this. Now going over to the engine bay, we ended up degreasing it, and of course I ended up using a very special European formula of degreaser to spray down, scrub it, and clean it as best we can. It's gonna be really nice to have a clean base to work with when we go to put a clean engine into it. And it only made sense because it was filthy. If we end up walking over here, you'll end up seeing a bunch of the stuff that we ended up taking off of the other engine that we're gonna use, like the power steering pump, because this one has, I believe it's called active steering. We have the AC compressor, and then this plethora of parts. Of course, we ended up taking the oil cooler off, and somebody kindly used it to hold the turbo up so it wouldn't fall over. That was good. We have the intake manifold, PR coils, and a bunch of other stuff. 335 diesel coolant tank. Of course, that's the factory DIMI, forward-facing charge pipe, the wastegate dump, upgraded motor mounts, upgraded transmission mounts. Hiding underneath here is going to be the 8 HP 45. So of course I end up having two. So I have an X-drive version and a rear-wheel drive version. I threw the torque converter on. Now for those of you at home that are considering doing this, you're going to use the torque converter off of the N55 engine. So this one specifically came off of, it was either an X5 with the N55 or the X3 with the N55. This is exactly what you need. It ends up having the flat flanges here, and this will bolt up directly to the flex plate on the N54. Now, because the original vehicle had a 6-bolt and we're going to an 8-bolt, we have an 8-bolt flex plate to bolt onto the back of the motor. So we're going to bolt that onto the back of the motor, and in turn we're going to bolt this to the back of the motor. For the bolts that came out, there are half of them or 3/4 of them that are aluminum. Now these are one-time use. You do not want to reuse them. Some of them are steel. So the plan is to bolt this transmission to the motor with the steel bolts. I'll probably temporarily put the aluminum bolts in case I feel that it's a little bit weak when you go to put it inside the engine bay. But for the most part, the aluminum bolts you can swap afterwards. So I'll take the aluminum ones to a bolt shop, and a grade 8.8 bolt will suffice. The only real other thing, actually I guess this would be a good comparison, is because this is out of an N20 engine, so the 4-cylinder, it's flat right up top here, whereas this one has the cutout for it. This ends up posing a bit of a problem because when you end up putting the starter here, you end up losing the eyelet to hold the engine and transmission. So we're trying to get a little bit crafty when we bolt it in, because we're going to be missing that hole to help bolt it into the vehicle. Now, some people could probably drill through this casing, but that's going to be a little bit too thin, and I don't really like that. So I'm going to leave this as is. This, if anything, will be for strength. And you just got to tap the one hole, chuck it in. If I could whip it out the car and it installs itself, that would be great, but it won't. Nope. It's now time for the motor to come off of the stand. We're going to pull the stand out of the way, and we're going to lower it just above a tire. Now this tire was used more of a safety thing, just in case the chain decided to slip or snap or whatever. We lower it enough so we can get the flex plate onto the back of it. The bolts that actually bolt the flex plate to the hub itself, because we're going with, I think it's an 8 bolt. Yeah, it's an 8-bolt flex plate. You need to end up using 8 very specific bolts that are going to be mounting it directly to the back of the crankshaft. Tightening it, you want to ensure that there's no grit or grime between the face of the flex disc and the end of the crankshaft, and tighten them slowly in a star pattern, alternating one against the other. And of course, me being either half asleep or in a rush, not sure whichever, I didn't end up putting Loctite on, so joke's on me. You want to make sure before you start to snug them down or torque them to spec that you're going to be using some red Loctite. In this case, I used some gel, not that it's needed, but whatever. Taylor ends up torquing the bolts on the back while I end up holding the crank. Now, as you're tightening it, the engine's going to be wanting to turn counterclockwise, and you don't want this to happen for the simple fact that the timing chain could get some slack and it could jump a tooth. So while Taylor starts to torque it, he ends up counting to 3, and as he counts to 3, I start to press in the opposite direction on the snout of the crankshaft. It's a 22 mil right on the end of the crank, right by the crank hub pulley itself. So again, as Taylor torques it, I put pressure in the opposite direction so that it doesn't slip or move at all. Afterwards, now it's time to mount the 8 HP. This was a bit annoying, and I decided to manhandle it, pick it up, throw it on the studs, while I waited ever so patiently for Taylor to put 2 bolts in opposing one another. Of course, by patient was lack thereof, but we got it done, so it really doesn't matter in the end. One thing you need to keep in mind when you're using one out of an N series, even though it may end up being an 8 HP, is right here. Now I put the smallest little blue Sharpie dot. I'm hoping that that's accurate. So what you need to do is you need to actually drill a hole similar to this so that it actually connects to the block itself. We're going to use a small drill bit and a punch so it doesn't walk around, and hopefully I don't make the hole too big, and hopefully it's where it needs to be. There. Taylor's going to end up taking off the engine mount. Now the reason we take off the driver's side engine mount is simply to get it up and around the steering shaft, because I don't want to disassemble it or get it loose. For here, we have the 2 brackets. So this is the original one off the 8-speed, and this is the 6 HP. If you put them side by side, now it's going to be a little bit harder for you guys to see, but these bolts are all lined up here, but these are offset ever so slightly. So that 1/2 inch could be enough for it not to work properly. So when you do an 8-speed swap, simply just unbolt the 8-speed one, put the 6-speed one in, like that. Put the 13s underneath and call it good. Now, of course, we're doing this simply to mount it in the vehicle, just because this one here wiggles a lot more, so it has more flex for us to be able to locate the bolts. And these ones here, being that these are the 2 series ones, they made them super, super soft and added this nylon tether to it. Ooh, yeah, don't do that. But these are soft. So when we go to tip the motor in, we can have it down like this. Taylor can put a couple of bolts in, and then we don't need to worry about the rear as we lower it onto the engine mounts. Of course, I have stiffer ones. I think they're a 95A. So they're going to be a lot stiffer than these. And for the 8-speed one, throw it at your buddy. Well, it's a moment of truth, ladies and gents, or gents, I'm sure. We're going to toss this lump in the car, and as a ceremonial thing, we're going to ride it like a cowboy and, you know, Alberta things. Next up, we're going to toss it in, hopefully not damage or ding anything, and go from there. While we go to install the engine and transmission, it's always good to end up having a second set of eyes and at least another pair of hands, just to see what you cannot. When you go to install this lump, the transmission itself, it ends up blocking where you would end up putting the chain when you go to pull the engine and transmission out. So the issue we ran into is that the engine was a little cockeyed when it was going in, and because it's such a tight fit, it was nothing but a pain. But of course we persevered and we got it done. With a couple bumps and bruises and some hurt egos, it was good that the buddies were able to help. It's April 12th, 2024. I'm reporting in after a disastrous week. Well, I guess it wasn't disastrous. Stressful weekend installing this engine. I guess I really can't complain. It wasn't all that bad, but of course, when you put the 8-speed out of a 4-cylinder, so like an N20 engine, you lose the hook to lift the actual engine. So all of the chains and contraptions I had didn't really work all that well because it ended up tipping the motor. Even 10 degrees was a big issue. So I'm going to show you where it was rubbing and the issues that we ran into. The valve cover right here, so this little piece, when it was tipped the extra 10%, this was getting caught and rubbing on everything, including the AC lines, brake line, rad support, and so forth. The entire engine, it was tipped about that, and it was kind of cockeyed. It was a huge pain in the backside, but we're chipping away. So there's a few things that I had an issue with. I had to remove the coils here because it was rubbing just on here. The coils are going to sit a bit lower. Essentially, I just took the extension piece out of here and they actually fit. Originally, they were sitting kind of about here, and I didn't think it was going to be an issue, but turns out it is. This gets lowered. It was probably 1.5 inches, almost 2 inches, and the coils have to flip upside down so that it fits just underneath, barely, like this. So you can see I even need to kind of slide it in like this, and there it goes. You can see where the wire ends up plugging in. There's not a whole lot of area for that one. So once they're bolted in, it's going to be pretty tight. Ideally, I'm going to see if I can somehow take this and bend it. I would like for the coils to sit a little bit straighter. This is not ideal. The boot's going to be right up against here, and I don't want to run into any issues if you hit a pothole or something. So I'll try and figure out if I can tip these a bit. Of course, with the 335 diesel tank, we're running into an issue with the port here. Yeah, otherwise it works really well. Let's just put that here so it can fall. Stay. Now this port, I'm going to end up cutting off, and we're going to put an NPT fitting just inside here. And I'm going to see if I can end up getting one that's a smaller fitting here, just because there wouldn't be too much material. But ideally, we're going to be cutting this flange off. If you see, that ain't going to work, especially the way the throttle body is. So we're going to have to do one of these, and then the hose is going to fit up and over the charge pipe. So that won't be the end of the world. Now the other issue I ran into was the throttle body. I test fit the alternator here just temporarily. It's still a big boy, so it comes out to about here. And being a BMP manifold, there was a handful of them that were welded at the wrong angle, and lo and behold, mine's the wrong angle. So for the throttle body itself, we're gonna have to position it in a way where it's actually going to clear everything. Now the actuator might end up being on top or on the bottom, but that's going to make things a little bit complicated when we go to bolt it all together. So for now, I just wanted to test fit this, get the headache out of the way, and go from there. Another issue I ran into, there's been a bunch of issues, but we're going to end up fighting through them, wasn't necessarily the power steering. I think it was the oil cooler lines. So the oil cooler lines, one thing to keep in mind is the ports on the 8-speed are 18 millimeter and the lines themselves are 12. So with Ken TCU, they just came out with an adapter plate. Essentially, it's a small sandwich that bolts into the 8 HP housing, and you just put the factory lines into it. For now, I'm going to be running the factory 6-speed cooler. It's going to be more than enough. Some people say you end up running 10-15 degrees cooler than if you were to run the 8-speed one or an aftermarket one, which overcools. Another issue I ran into, I'm not sure if I showed, is this. This output flange on the 6 HP is actually larger, so this Gibo or flex disc doesn't fit on the 8 HP. So what we're going to need to do is the nut just inside here. Let's see if I can show you. That nut there is a 12.34 mil. You're going to need a deep socket 34 mil to get that off. Now it's only torqued to apparently 44 Newton meters, so it's not the end of the world. But I need to order that socket. It's going to be relatively easy, knock on wood. That one I just need to put onto the 8-speed, and the 8-speed is going to essentially be a spare. Now the 8-speed is out of a 2 series, so the flange is smaller. I think it's roughly 10 mil or whatever it is. But that's a bit of an update. We've got the Nice shiny alternator ready to go in, the sad motor sitting on the stand, and maybe some fancy boys, because apparently I never own real wheels. We're gonna just stick with the factory oil cooler for now to keep costs down. It really doesn't need to be changed. I wanna get it done, but I don't wanna be rushing this. So I'm gonna end up just playing Tetris. We're going to figure that dilemma out and chip away at getting it put together. We ended up removing the intake manifold because it was just there for mock-up purposes. Now, the manifold was kind of in the way. I wanted to make sure that all of the connectors were routed properly, where there'd be no tension, and make sure that the lengths were correct. So removing the manifold gave us a little bit more room for us to install the recently rebuilt alternator. Of course, between two, both are bad, so I figured at this time, since it'd be a nuisance to change afterwards, I would just have it rebuilt. After the alternator gets installed, we can move on to the AC compressor and again replace the intake manifold for testing and clearance purposes. This is where I had to start scratching my head to figure out how everything was going to work and what I was going to do for the orientation of the throttle body. Afterwards, I decided to take a bit of a break and Taylor slid underneath to replace the torque converter bolts. Same as before, so as you go to replace them, we end up putting some blue Loctite on them. As I spin the motor, Taylor throws them in, one opposing the other, and then you go from there. For the most part, we got the majority of the stuff all plugged in and where it needs to go. The next part is going to be putting the intake manifold on. Just wanted to make sure, because the intake manifold, it takes up quite a bit of real estate, that we're not going to have to take it in and out and in and out. So I wanted to make sure that when we were at the time where we could just put it in, we leave it, we're good. So I'm going to show you what we ended up doing, give you a bit of a rundown. For all of these here, this branch of wires are what are going to go to the DME box, and there's going to be a few of them, like the intake TMAP. This is going to be, I believe, EVAP. And then there's going to be another one. This one here you're not going to use, that's for the PCV heater, so we can just ignore that. I don't think I'm going to end up putting the PCV heater in line. There's no point, it's just going to be a vented catch can at that point. We have the 3.5 bar extension cable. Now, why PR made it this bloody long, I have no idea, but that's okay, whatever, we'll deal with that. Over here is the one we extended for the throttle body. This is going to sit somewhere up and around, so let's put it with that one there. And these two here are going to be for the AC. This one goes here, that one goes just over there. I put a little rubber cap on the alternator because the last thing you need is to touch the positive post when the battery's connected and have it short or ground on something. One kind of neat thing that I ended up doing is from the brake booster here, I used the factory one and took out the adapter piece here that had the two ports facing that way towards the vacuum pots. So for this one here, it's actually off an N55. It clips right on top of the high pressure fuel pump. It runs up and around, and it actually has a bracket for there. Then it follows up and around and it goes to the factory brake booster line, which is pretty neat. So we're gonna chip away at it. The coolant tank works good. I have a good idea as to how I'm going to put the power steering reservoir, at least the billet portion from 0 and we'll see how it goes. Of course, there's gonna be some small things that we're gonna need to deal with when the time comes, but even small little details like these aluminum posts will stand the coolant tank off about 1.5 inches. That'll give us enough clearance for the hose that comes off of the coolant tank to clear the intake manifold and the throttle body. Okay, we're gonna get back at it. It is now the time for the intake manifold to go to its final resting place. It was a bit of a nuisance to get it in place, but with a little perseverance, again, we ended up getting it where it needed to be. Don't end up putting the studs in. What we ended up doing is we just put one to hold the manifold in place and then slowly thread them in one by one. Now, when you go to snug it down, make sure that you end up tightening one nut from across the other nut so that it ends up snugging down evenly and symmetrical. Taylor had a great idea that because this is going to be buried in behind everything else, that we should smoke test it while it's in there and while we have access. And lo and behold, it's fine, thankfully. For the catch cans, the high side was relatively easy. The BMS can that we used goes into the location that you would expect on the strut bar here. The lines that came with it were a touch too short for it to clear the manifold, so we ended up needing to wait to get some reinforced silicone hoses. The small one, we ended up mounting to this weird plastic little bracket. It wasn't ideal, but you know what? It worked out pretty good. Afterwards, once we ended up getting the reinforced silicone hose, of course I didn't tell them I wanted black, so they gave me blue, which I guess kind of goes with the theme. We ended up routing both catch cans, the high side and the low side, to the respective valves. Of course, high side for the high flapper valve and the low side to the RB PCV delete. We end up moving on to all the small fiddly stuff. Now, because we ended up moving the coolant tank over to the opposite side, you need to extend the coolant hose with a 5/8 piece of heater hose. It wasn't the end of the world, but sitting and being able to stare at it head on was actually relatively nice. Once you end up adapting it with a few brass barb fittings and you throw on some hose clamps, the hardest part was trying to get the length correct to ensure that the hose wasn't going to kink and it wasn't going to bend. After we ended up getting the hose where we needed it, we start by installing all of the pulleys. Of course, if you've watched any of our other videos before, it's all relatively straightforward. Put a little bit of Loctite on each bolt, put the pulleys in their respective locations, and once you're done, torque them to spec, put all the caps on, and put the belt on. We ended up running into a couple of issues. Taylor had a good idea. Don't admit to him or whatever, don't tell him I said this. But we had a couple of issues with exhaust manifold and the wastegate. We ended up checking for leaks with a smoke tester. So we have the trusty smoke tester jerry-rigged here with the Optima battery. Now the issue we ran into was that clamp right back there. What in the hell was that? Is that a wild doggo? Hey you! The flange in behind there that meets the two manifolds, or where the two manifolds meet, one portion is supposed to go inside the other, and then the outer flanges are meant to sit flat on top of each other. Now when you end up tightening that V-band, they're meant to be a tight seal. Of course I ended up cranking that one down and it's still leaking for whatever reason when we smoke test it. And the wastegate here is leaking from everywhere possible. So right inside here, you can't quite see, but this flange is dead flat. Now, I did tighten it as tight as I could, but you can still ever so slightly rotate the wastegate with enough force. Inside of this flange here, there's going to be a fire ring that ends up sealing the valve on the bottom of this wastegate. Now, when we put smoke right here where the turbo is, it ends up leaking right through this flange here, so manifold to wastegate, and then from inside here, that flange to the dump tube. We ended up moving it up and around here just to test it and smoke it, but of course it's leaking right through this clamp here for whatever reason and right through here. I don't quite know what the solution is going to be, so right now I was hoping to have it done for the weekend and have the front end put on, but I have a feeling it's going to be a few day hiatus or whatever you want to call it. I don't know if I need to take the flange off to have that little portion machined down so it doesn't leak. Try and get some ghetto ingenuity. I don't know what's going to be needed for the wastegate, but it's going to take a little bit more time, and we'll see what the solution is. I don't know, maybe a skim a gasket maker. That's the first thing that comes to mind, but I'm a little bit ghetto in that sense. I guess we're going to see. Yep, as some of you guessed it, my ghetto ingenuity ended up getting the better of me, and I layered this MFer with the thickest layer of copper RTV. I asked O13 what they thought, and of course they said the same thing. They put a thick layer of RTV as well and send it home. For the wastegate portion, it ends up getting a little more complicated. There's a few more details that you need to keep in mind. These two fire rings, the shiny one is a brand new one, and the one that looks a bit weathered is the used one. I wasn't completely set on the finish, so what I ended up doing is I took the fire ring and I gave it a bidirectional finish with my orbital palm sounder, and this is what it looks like afterwards. This should seal a lot better against the manifold. When the fire ring sits just inside of the wastegate, when you end up clamping it onto the manifold itself, it's meant to push the fire ring against the valve. Now when we go to mount it onto the manifold itself, it's leaking both through the V-band clamp and through the fire ring out of the downpipe, or I guess you could say the screamer pipe. Easiest way for us to fix it, yep, you guessed it again, a nice skim of copper RTV, both on the fire ring and onto the faces of each flange, bottom of the fire ring and the bottom of the wastegate. After we get it into place and we snug it down, we're going to let it cure for the 24 hours that's recommended on the packaging. I didn't want to induce any oil because of the actual smoke test, so we left it be and just made sure that everything was okay. We came back the next day and of course it doesn't leak, and that put a smile on my face because this is something that I've been dealing with for some time now and I didn't want to be dealing with it anymore. After struggling with the wastegate, I move over to simple things. I didn't want to pull the entire washer tube out, so I just wrap it quickly with some gold reflective tape and zip tie the ends. We're going to be moving on to mounting the turbo for its final time and clocking it for the outlet. Tradition would have it, every time you mount a turbo, you need to give that little billet spoolie boy a little spinny spin. Whee! This is where the aggravation really started to set in. Everything started to look good and started to come together, but as soon as we started mounting the charge pipe, is when we started to realize the fitment was absolute garbage and the tolerances are so razor thin. We end up mounting the upper coolant hose and it seemed to work, but it kind of puts tension on the charge pipe. Here you can see how close everything sat. If it wasn't within 1 or 2 millimeter tolerance, it was just sitting right against one another. We decided to move past the charge pipe and all that. I figured I would deal with it later. We ended up going to install the radiator, the AC condenser, and the power steering cooler. After we end up having those satisfying clicks of all the hoses and lines getting clipped in, we end up moving forward to fitting the intercooler. Of course, this intercooler is massive and we needed to give a little bit of clearancing because we didn't want to leave it for self-clearancing. So we pull out the Dremel, we end up giving it a little bit more room and go to reinstall the intercooler itself. What I do recommend with this intercooler, because I have a bunch of the factory transmission pan bolts with the wide head available, when you use these and you tap them into the plastic housing, they go further in and the wide head ensures that the intercooler is going to be held properly without breaking off. Next, we put on the rad support. You need to make sure that the plastic on either side you end up trimming. Because the chunky boy needs a lot of room, we end up having to trim it a few times, but once it clears, you can throw the bolts in and you're ready to go. Keeping with the theme, we're throwing in the rad fan and surprise, surprise, nothing fits. You can see the little doggo running around. That's going to be the only solace in this little clip. I thought that it was going to end up working, so I decided to take the port off of the blow-off valve. Still didn't work, hit the AC line and it was being a nuisance. To an extent, I threw in the towel, loosened the entire front end and tipped it forward so that I could finally wheel it in and pass the blow-off valve. Afterwards, I started to see a light at the end of the tunnel. I moved over to the DME and I started to replace it. It's good to, when you take things like this apart, to take photos just to ensure that you know which way it goes. I can't say that I have a decent memory, but you know what? It really wasn't all that bad. After reviewing and doing a voiceover for the majority of this video, I'm glad to realize that the PTSD is not going to set in. We're going to end up replacing the front bumper, and I really can't believe I'm at this point. It's been 84 long years, but the vehicle is at its state. I've got good news and bad news for you. Good news is, vehicle's like 95% done. Bad news is we're waiting for the transmission cooler adapter from CAN TCU. We can't start it without the CAN TCU adapter, so we need to wait for that adapter to throw it in to fill the transmission, and then eventually after Ken from Kenformance has programmed the vehicle, then we can start it. So there's a little bit left, but I'll give you a rundown as to what the car looks like right now. This intake manifold, I believe again it's the BMP one, was absolutely awful to install. As you can see, we ended up needing to use, I believe they're 1.5-inch standoffs here for the coolant reservoir. I wanted to use the 335 diesel coolant reservoir, but in turn, it needed to be lifted so that this hose kind of goes up and around to the upper rad hose. The charge pipe itself, the clip is going to be extremely tight because everything is all sandwiched and wedged. You can't see underneath there, or maybe you can. You have one coolant hose way down here that's resting right against the charge pipe itself, and the one up top here. It should be okay. It might be okay, I'm not sure. I had to make this one bracket to hold the power steering reservoir. I got it to look relatively okay, and it fits. Now, I have a 335 diesel one off for an E90. It doesn't fit. What I didn't realize is the 1 Series has one single hood latch, and these two pieces, it's not the filler piece like you would have on the E90 or 92. It's 2 individual ones and 4 screws. So for obvious reasons, I had to reuse the factory one, and it does sit up quite a bit. So all I did in the meantime is chopped it here and it looks fine. I opted to go with the 335 oil cooler lines for 2 reasons. 1, I didn't really like how it kind of looped up and over, and 2, mine were a bit crusty. So I borrowed these off a spare motor from a buddy. They go into the factory 135 cooler. Now I tried to change the cooler itself. If you can see it there, I tried to change the cooler with a 335 gas motor. Doesn't fit. So the only part that actually fits is the upper coolant, or sorry, the upper oil hoses, cooler hoses. Anyways, you know what I'm getting at. Small things like the CTS, I think it's called the B Cool cap, whatever. There was clearance issues with the PR coils, so I took the bracket off and bent them up maybe 10 degrees so that you can see here they just clear. Now if I go to change the filter, I may need to take the 2 10mm bolts out, move the coil, and then access the filter. Not the end of the world. 2 catch cans, of course they're hidden in behind this monstrosity of wiring. The low side, which is a Mishimoto style, along with buried inside here, a BMS style catch can. So that's the high side, that's the low side, and this is venting the rear can. Up and behind here, under the wiring, if you can see, we have the PCV, factory PCV flapper right here. That goes to the silicone hose, which goes over to the catch can, and then the low side, right inside here, is the RB PCV valve that integrates a Toyota Supra pump, or sorry, Toyota Supra PCV. So that little smaller silicone hose goes to the Mishimoto can, and then the out from that to the evap line, which ultimately goes to the throttle body. Here I found a bracket. I'm not sure exactly what it was for, but I repurposed it for the MAC valve. I ended up hot gluing the MAC valve in place. The 2 lines here that are going to the heat loom go down to the wastegate. So there's high and low. In behind here you can't see, but this line and this line here go to a T-piece. So you have here, which I believe is the front of the turbo, and then MAC valve, and the other one goes to the wastegate. So this is plumbed correctly. The wiring's hidden up and over here. It's peeking out just in behind here, but I have it run just like factory. This will ultimately live there, and one of these pressure converter lines will reach in behind here. There. So there's a little bit of work to do. Downpipe fits, we're converting to single bank. So this bolt here, or this nut, whatever we're gonna call it, this is where the primary O2 sensor is gonna be housed, and the secondary is gonna be near the bottom. So I need to wire that. Otherwise, it's looking pretty good. That's all for now. We're gonna wait for the Ken TCU adapter and finish this up. There's only maybe a day's worth of plugging around, but in the next video, we're gonna give you a first start, and hopefully it goes without issue, because we did do quite a bit. We didn't open the motor, but there was still a lot that was done. So crossing fingers. That's all for today. Feel free to like and subscribe. Hit the dingle jingle thing. That dude posted a video if you want, and we'll see you guys on the next one. Beautiful. Chef's kiss.
Tony, where'd you put the 8mm?
I didn't touch the 8mm.
Where'd you put it?
I didn't touch it.
Where'd you put it?
I hate you some days. Well, here we are.
I know.
This is gonna be one of those ones where it's like, yeah, that's me. You're probably wondering how I got myself into this situation. Yeah, that's Taylor.